Man attacked by lion returns. 10 years later, the animal's reaction shocks everyone. The African sun cast long shadows across the Masai Mara as David Richardson stepped out of the dusty Land Cruiser, his prosthetic arm catching the golden light. 10 years had passed since his last visit to this place. 10 years since a moment of curiosity had changed his life forever. Now, at 45, he stood on the same red earth where he had nearly died, ready to face the memories that had haunted him for a decade. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Richardson?" asked Samuel, the experienced safari guide who had volunteered to accompany him on this deeply personal journey. Samuel had heard the story, as had most guides in Kenya. It was a tale that served as a sobering reminder of why safety protocols existed. David nodded, flexing his remaining hand nervously. "I need to do this, Samuel. I've carried this weight for too long." The story began in 2015, when David was a successful architect from London, celebrating his 35th birthday with what was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. He had always been fascinated by wildlife, spending countless hours watching documentaries about African predators. When his wife Sarah surprised him with a luxury safari package to Kenya, he was overjoyed. That fateful day started like any other safari morning. David and Sarah joined their group in an open-top vehicle, cameras ready, hearts racing with anticipation. Their guide, a veteran named Joseph, had briefed them thoroughly about safety protocols. Stay seated, keep quiet during animal encounters, and under no circumstances should anyone open the vehicle's protective barriers. The morning had been spectacular. They had witnessed a pride of lions lounging under an acacia tree, elephants bathing in a watering hole, and a cheetah stalking through the tall grass. David was in photographer's paradise, capturing every moment through his lens. It was during the afternoon game drive when everything changed. The group had stopped to observe a magnificent male lion, approximately 400 pounds of pure muscle and mane, resting alone about 30 meters from their vehicle. The lion seemed relaxed, occasionally lifting his massive head to survey his territory before settling back into his afternoon slumber. David, eager for the perfect shot, found himself frustrated by the vehicle's protective glass, which was creating a slight glare in his photographs. In a moment that would haunt him forever, he made a decision that went against every safety briefing he had received. While Joseph was distracted, helping another guest identify a bird species, David quietly unlatched the vehicle's side window and slid it open. The change in the lion's demeanor was instantaneous. The magnificent creature's head snapped up, his golden eyes locking onto the vehicle with laser focus. What David didn't know was that this particular male, known to local guides as Simba wa Mfalme, the king lion, had recently been challenged by younger males and was already on edge, territorial and unpredictable. If you're finding this story as gripping as we intended, please take a moment to like this post and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will leave you speechless. The attack happened faster than anyone could react. The lion exploded into motion, covering the 30 meters in mere seconds with the fluid grace that made him apex predator. Joseph shouted a warning, but it was too late. As David leaned out slightly for his shot, Simba wa Mfalme launched himself at the vehicle. The impact was devastating. The lion's powerful front paws caught David's extended arm, his claws designed by evolution to take down 600-pound buffalo. The force yanked David partially through the window, his camera flying into the dust as he came face to face with 400 pounds of angry predator. Time seemed to move in slow motion. David would later remember the lion's eyes, not cruel or malicious, but wild and afraid, acting on instinct to defend what he perceived as his territory. The massive jaws clamped down on David's forearm, the pressure so intense that he could hear his own bones splintering. Sarah's screams mixed with Joseph's shouts as the guide frantically started the engine, trying to create enough motion to discourage the lion's attack. Other passengers threw water bottles and anything else they could find, while Sarah grabbed her husband's shoulders, trying desperately to pull him back into the vehicle. The struggle lasted less than a minute, but to David it felt like an eternity. The lion's natural instincts eventually kicked in. This strange, metal prey wasn't behaving like anything he understood. With a final, bone-crushing bite that severed David's arm just below the elbow, Simba wa Mfalme released his grip and retreated, shaking his massive mane as if confused by the entire encounter. The race to save David's life became a testament to human determination and the tight-knit nature of Kenya's safari community. Joseph, keeping pressure on the wound with makeshift tourniquets, drove like a man possessed toward the nearest airstrip while radioing for emergency medical assistance. Every guide in the area mobilized, creating a human chain of support that extended from the Mara to Nairobi. David spent 3 weeks in a Kenyan hospital fighting for his life. Infection was the primary concern. Lion mouths contain bacteria that can kill, even if the initial trauma doesn't. Sarah never left his bedside, watching her husband drift in and out of consciousness, while doctors worked around the clock to stabilize him. The severed arm was never recovered. Local guides searched the area extensively, but the African bush has a way of reclaiming everything. David would later say he didn't want it back anyway. It belonged to the lion now, part of a story that had fundamentally changed who he was. Recovery was a grueling process that extended far beyond the physical healing. Back in London, David faced months of rehabilitation, learning to navigate the world with one arm while dealing with the psychological trauma of the attack. Nightmares plagued his sleep, and he found himself jumping at unexpected sounds. The confident, adventurous man who had boarded the plane to Kenya seemed like a stranger. Sarah stood by him through everything, but David could see the worry in her eyes, the way she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. Their relationship, once built on shared adventures and spontaneous decisions, became careful and measured. David felt like he was living his life wrapped in bubble wrap, protected but somehow diminished. The prosthetic arm helped with daily tasks, but felt foreign and mechanical. David, who had spent his career creating beautiful buildings with his hands, now struggled with simple sketches. His architectural firm was understanding, providing modified equipment and flexible schedules, but David could feel the pitying looks from colleagues who didn't know how to interact with the new version of him. Years passed. David learned to adapt, becoming proficient with his prosthetic and finding new ways to express his creativity. He and Sarah eventually had 2 children, and life took on a different rhythm, but Africa never left his thoughts. In quiet moments, he would find himself thinking about the lion, not with anger or fear, but with a strange sense of unfinished business. The decision to return came gradually. David began following news from the Mara, learning about conservation efforts and the challenges facing lion populations. Through social media groups and safari websites, he discovered that Simba wa Mfalme was still alive, now the undisputed king of his territory, father to multiple prides. Sarah was initially horrified by the idea of returning. "Why would you want to go back there?" she asked, during one of their many discussions about his growing obsession with the return trip. "Haven't you been through enough?" But David couldn't explain the pull he felt. It wasn't about confronting his fears or seeking closure in any traditional sense. It was something deeper, a recognition that his story with Africa, and specifically with Simba wa Mfalme, wasn't finished. The lion had taken something from him, yes, but in return, David felt he had learned something about the raw, uncompromising nature of the wild that most people never experience. Dr. Martinez, David's therapist, was cautiously supportive of the idea. "Sometimes," she explained, "we need to return to the scene of our trauma not to relive it, but to recontextualize it. If you feel called to go back, and you believe you're emotionally prepared, it might be exactly what you need." The planning took months. David connected with current guides in the Mara, explaining his unusual request. Most were initially reluctant. The story of his attack was well known, and no guide wanted to be responsible for a repeat incident. But Samuel Kiplagat, a young guide who had heard the story as a cautionary tale during his training, was intrigued by David's motivation. "I want to understand," Samuel told David during their video calls. "You're not coming back for revenge or to prove something to others. You're coming back for yourself, to complete something that was left unfinished." The flight to Nairobi brought back a flood of memories. David's prosthetic arm ached during the long journey. Phantom pain that his doctors said was psychological but felt entirely real. Sarah had wanted to come, but David had gently refused. This was something he needed to do alone, a conversation between himself and the continent that had marked him so profoundly. Samuel met him at Wilson Airport, a slight man in his 30s with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years working in the bush. They drove toward the Mara in comfortable conversation, Samuel sharing updates about the Conservancy and the challenges facing wildlife in an increasingly developed Kenya. "Simba wa Mfalme is still there," Samuel confirmed as they approached the Mara. "He's older now, maybe 15 years old, which is ancient for a wild lion. His mane has grey streaks and he's lost some weight, but he's still the king of this territory. The younger males respect him, and his bloodline is strong in the area." They spent the first day simply driving through the Conservancy, allowing David to reacclimatize to the sights, sounds, and smells of the African bush. Everything felt familiar, yet strange, like revisiting a childhood home as an adult. The baobab trees, the red earth, the endless horizon. It all looked exactly as David remembered, yet his perspective had shifted fundamentally. That evening, around a campfire at their simple camp, Samuel asked the question that had been hanging in the air all day. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish when we find him?" David stared into the flames, considering his answer carefully. "I don't know," he admitted. "And for 10 years, I've carried this story with me, and it's always felt incomplete. The lion was just being a lion. He wasn't evil or malicious. He was protecting his territory from what he perceived as a threat. But I've never had the chance to... I don't know how to explain it. To close the circle, maybe." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "In Maasai culture, we believe that when two spirits encounter each other in such a profound way, they become connected. Perhaps you're feeling that connection." The next morning, they set out specifically to locate Simba wa Mfalme. Samuel had been in radio contact with other guides, and the lion had been spotted the previous evening near the same area where the attack had occurred a decade earlier. David felt his heart rate increase as they approached the familiar acacia grove, and then they saw him. Simba wa Mfalme lay in the shade of the same tree where David remembered him from that fateful day. But this lion was different from David's memories. The magnificent creature was visibly older, his once pristine mane now streaked with grey, his powerful frame slightly diminished by age. But his presence was unmistakable. This was still the king of his domain. Samuel parked the vehicle at a respectful distance, exactly where the attack had occurred 10 years earlier. David felt a strange sense of déjà vu, mixed with profound emotion. The lion lifted his massive head, surveying the vehicle with the same calm intensity David remembered. "He's looking at us," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Samuel observed the lion's body language carefully. "He's curious, but not threatened. That's unusual. He's normally more wary of vehicles." What happened next would stay with David for the rest of his life. As he watched, Simba wa Mfalme rose slowly to his feet and began walking toward their vehicle. Not stalking, not hunting, but moving with deliberate purpose. Samuel's hand moved instinctively to the ignition, but something in the lion's demeanor stopped him. "He recognizes something," Samuel breathed. "This is not normal behavior." The lion approached to within 10 meters of the vehicle and stopped. For several long moments, predator and former prey simply looked at each other. David could see intelligence in those golden eyes, and something else, a kind of acknowledgement that defied easy explanation. Then, in a gesture that neither David nor Samuel could have anticipated, Simba wa Mfalme sat down. Not the alert crouch of a hunting predator, but the relaxed posture of an animal at ease. He remained there for nearly 20 minutes, occasionally shifting his gaze between David and the surrounding landscape, as if sharing a moment of quiet contemplation. David felt tears streaming down his face, a decade of complex emotions finally finding release. This wasn't the vengeful confrontation he had sometimes imagined, nor was it the fearful encounter he had dreaded. It was something far more profound, a moment of mutual recognition between two beings whose lives had been forever intertwined by a single, transformative moment. "I forgive you," David whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was forgiving. The lion for being wild, himself for making a foolish decision, the universe for the randomness that had brought them together. As if responding to some invisible signal, Simba wa Mfalme rose and began walking away. He paused once, looking back over his shoulder at the vehicle, before disappearing into the tall grass with the fluid grace that had made him legendary among the guides of the Mara. Samuel was quiet for a long time after the lion departed. Finally, he turned to David with wonder in his eyes. "In 15 years of guiding, I have never seen anything like that. It was as if he remembered you." The journey back to camp was filled with contemplative silence. David felt something inside him had shifted, a weight he had carried for a decade finally lifting. The lion had given him something unexpected, not closure in the traditional sense, but a different kind of understanding about his place in the natural world. That evening, David called Sarah from the satellite phone at camp. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice tight with worry despite the distance. "It was perfect," David replied, surprising himself with the truth of that statement. "I can't explain it, but seeing him again, it wasn't about the attack anymore. It was about understanding that we're all just part of something bigger than ourselves." The flight home gave David time to process the experience. As London's grey skyline came into view, he felt like he was returning as a different person than the one who had left just a week earlier. The prosthetic arm that had felt like a constant reminder of trauma now felt simply like a part of who he was. A man who had survived something extraordinary and lived to find meaning in it. Back home, David threw himself into his work with renewed passion. He began specializing in sustainable architecture, designing buildings that worked in harmony with their natural environments rather than dominating them. His prosthetic became a conversation starter rather than a source of shame, allowing him to share his story and advocate for wildlife conservation. 6 months after his return, David received an unexpected message through the safari company's social media page. It was from Samuel, accompanied by a photo that made David's heart skip a beat. The image showed Simba wa Mfalme with 3 young cubs, teaching them to hunt in the same area where he had encountered David. "He's passing on his legacy," Samuel's message read. "The circle continues." David shared the photo with Sarah that evening as they tucked their own children into bed. His daughter, now 7, had heard simplified versions of Daddy's lion story and was fascinated by the idea that the lion was now teaching his own babies. "Will you go back again?" Sarah asked later as they sat together in their garden. David considered the question. "Maybe someday," he replied, "but not because I need to. If I go back, it will be because I want to see how the story continues to unfold." The encounter with Simba wa Mfalme had taught David that some stories don't end, they simply evolve. His relationship with Africa, with wildlife, and with his own sense of identity had been forever changed by a moment of poor judgment a decade earlier. But rather than allowing that moment to define him through fear and regret, he had found a way to let it transform him into someone more aware of his connection to the natural world. 2 years later, David received news that would bring the story full circle in an unexpected way. Simba wa Mfalme had died peacefully in his territory, having lived longer than most wild lions. His cubs, now grown, had established their own territories, carrying forward the genetic legacy of the king who had once changed a human's life in an instant of wild instinct. David felt a profound sadness at the news, mixed with gratitude. The lion had given him something beyond the physical trauma, a story that had ultimately led to greater purpose and understanding. In taking his arm, Simba wa Mfalme had somehow given him a different kind of strength. At the memorial service David organized at the London Zoo to honor both the lion and wildlife conservation efforts, he spoke to a crowd of supporters and fellow advocates. His prosthetic caught the light as he gestured, no longer a source of self-consciousness, but simply part of the story he was telling. Simba wa Mfalme taught me that we are all connected in ways we don't always understand. David concluded his speech. Sometimes the most profound lessons come from our most challenging moments. He took something from me, yes, but in return he gave me a purpose I never could have imagined. The story of David and Simba wa Mfalme became part of safari lore, told around campfires throughout East Africa. But unlike many such tales, this one didn't end in tragedy or revenge. It ended in understanding, a reminder that sometimes the things that wound us most deeply also have the power to heal us, if we have the courage to return and face them with an open heart. David still wakes up sometimes, dreaming of golden eyes and the red dust of the Masai Mara. But now, instead of nightmares, these dreams feel like visits from an old friend, a wild, magnificent friend who taught him that strength comes not from avoiding our fears, but from learning to see them as part of a larger story that connects all living things. The prosthetic arm hangs on a hook by his bedside each night, a reminder not of what was lost, but of what was gained, wisdom, purpose, and an unbreakable connection to the wild heart of Africa that beats within him still.